There we go. Okay, great. Well, good. I was so happy that you were pleased with my questions. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it takes an angle that I wish more people would look at. So I was delighted.
good. So I guess we can just start out. I was so thrilled to get into Millicent's journal and see, some of that history and her thinking process, and especially I was taken by her drawings of the Natural History Museum, as I mentioned, and so yeah, I would just really be interested in your take or the kinds of things maybe Paul shared with you about, that's a thread into the future of where the museum is situated. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think her love of museums was contagious. I know that my father also had that through his life. But to kind of start back with her to begin with, I think that she was in a great place. She grew up in New York City, where there were a lot of cultural and museums of great importance even in that time.
yeah.
And I think that she was really influenced by that. I think her mother was a huge influence. Her mother was a big Francophile. She loved all things French, and they spent a lot of time in France.
Mhm.
I think her mother was also a real appreciator of fine arts. She was one of the young women that um, uh, Henry Huddleston Rogers' best friend, Mark Twain,
Uh-huh.
Samuel Clemens, used to correspond with these young ladies regularly. And in fact, there's a book written about their correspondence. And I think that that was an early introduction for her through her mother of literature and creative thought.
Yeah.
Um, I think, as you said, she lived through two world wars. She saw a lot of changes. Her father was in the First World War. And I think that affected her into the Second World War, where she started the hospital, the
Yeah.
Medical Relief Fund. I can't remember the name completely.
Yeah.
So I think in that way, she was influenced by both her parents and the events of the time.
Mhm.
She grew up in the Roaring Twenties when she came of age, and she lived it, as I'm sure few people could. She met my grandfather through dancing, apparently, and I think that's sort of an entertaining story in itself. But she was a collector, and I don't know if she got that from her mother or if that just was on her own. But she loved all sorts of art, and it wasn't just Native American art. She had a beautiful collection of Impressionist paintings. She liked modern art, and that also influenced my father.
Mhm.
When she passed away, her estate was in essence broke, but she had collected a fortune in art.
Right.
And my father and my uncle, basically had to, sort through what they could keep and what had to be liquidated to pay off all the debts.
Hmm.
But at the end of that, they both had amazing art collections in their own right.
Hmm.
And I think that they learned a lot about art from going through the process of going through her estate, seeing each piece and what it was. And I don't know that they had a lot of, art history before that, but
Oh,
they certainly had a lot by the time the estate was finished.
wow.
And that carried on from, he continued to collect. And he was influenced by his mother in his tastes. He loved Impressionists and kept several Impressionist paintings that she had. He loved Fabergé jewelry like she did. In fact, she gave him a cigarette box to sort of start his collection, which was impressive, and so was hers.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that also parlayed into when she finally went to the Southwest. He was one of the only sons to go with her, and he stayed with her, and he was on almost all of her collecting expeditions. He talked about getting bed bugs in hotels in Gallup, and freezing their butts off at Zuni when they were watching the Shalico dance. And I think that he felt as she did that was a really influential thing in his life.
Hmm.
And when she passed, and he had to decide what to do with the collections. I think it's when he really started to think about preserving the Native American collection for something besides himself or the family.
Hmm.
He saw how important it was and how important it was to New Mexico, and he did not want it to leave New Mexico, and he did not want it to leave Taos.
Yeah, that's
I'm sorry.
in some correspondence I've seen that he that was one thing that was super important to him, that it stay in Taos, which the alternative,
Absolutely.
I suppose, would be that it could have potentially been on sort of the open market or gone someplace else to another museum. And so he must have just decided to go ahead and, you know, start the museum on his own.
Well, and that was, you know, where he decided to put it in Taos was against a lot of advice that he had gotten to put it in a place where there was more affluence.
Oh, really?
But he didn't. Yes, absolutely. And he said, no, you know, this is a poor community. It's the place that needs it the most. He really saw the museum as being something that would bring people to Taos. And I think he really hoped that it would.
That's significant. I mean, that's a significant attitude that could and should be incorporated more into our voice into the community, because
I wish it was better known.
yeah.
My father did a lot of things for the community behind the scenes. I don't think it's known that he was the anonymous donor that paid for the preservation and repair of the main altar in the Ranchos Church back in the 80s.
Oh, really?
But he did, and he didn't want. By the 80s, our Native American collection at the museum was pretty comprehensive as far as he was concerned.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't really looking to add to it besides textiles that were extraordinary.
Okay.
But then he started to build a relationship with Anita Day. Anita Day was, I believe, the niece of Maria Martinez. And in your question, you had asked if Millicent had started that relationship with the Martinez family. I don't know if she did. I know she may have collected some pieces, but as far as I know, it was my father and Anita Day that really built that relationship, and she very much wanted that collection to go to a good museum, and she wanted it to go to the Millicent Rogers.
Okay.
And you know, I'm really grateful that we eventually were able to build this beautiful gallery to house that collection, because I always felt that putting it in the hallway as it started was far from what it deserved.
Is that where it was at the beginning?
Yeah, it was in that hallway that transitions from the different pueblos into the jewelry collection.
Yeah.
And it was very, well, obviously, for the type of collection it was and for the amount it was, it needed its own gallery. So I'm really happy to see it has one now.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's certainly, you know, one of, if not the biggest highlights of the museum. And one of the aspects of that gallery that is so enchanting to me is it really, there's something in there for all ages. The 2 to 4-year-olds have fun in there as well. So it was really very well done. And I don't know if it was at that time or if it existed prior to the development of that gallery, but it's very unique and very helpful in terms of interpretation to have those displays that show the process of the pottery making. So yeah,
yeah, I love those dioramas. I love the fact that it has her history as well, with the awards that she received from, you know, various points in her life. But I think it's one of our better galleries for sure.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And, you know, just to continue on the vein of my father's collecting habits, you know, once he had sort of gotten the Martinez collection, he really became sort of obsessed with his family's history in Argentina.
Oh, okay.
And for the last few years of his life, he spent a lot of time in Argentina.
Did he? Okay. Well, that makes sense. So the pieces that are in gallery 8 downstairs, because so much of that came from your dad's collections, were those collected then like in the 80s?
They were,
Nice.
and they were all in his home in Taos. They were mostly in his bedroom in Taos, which was rather macabre by most people's standards, but he loved it.
As I saw that in Millicent's journal. So what I could discern from that is that was about a 6-month time period when she was 14 turning 15 is what it looked like to me in the dates there. And so at that young age, to be so self-aware politically of things that were going on and be caring about things, and oh, I'm going to the Natural History Museum to educate myself. And I imagine too that some of her activities that she participated in were limited because of her health issues. I sometimes when I'm talking to people about Millicent, I'll put the questions out there. What were her constraints or her boundaries, or how were her choices limited? Just to kind of get the thinking going in some different ways, because I think that those health challenges that she faced really gave her a level of compassion.
I don't have a lot of insight into that, unfortunately, but I feel the same way. I think she definitely, I think she knew her time was limited. I mean, she had been told she might not live past 17.
Mm-hmm.
So she embraced life like I think few people do,
Mm-hmm.
because she knew it wasn't, she never knew when it was going to end.
Right.
And my father, talked about that quite a bit. And I think that sense of mortality made her a compassionate person. I'm not sure that a lot of other women with her affluence would have had that kind of compassion.
Right.
And I think it showed more and more as she became older, I think, as well. I mean, my God, I'm older than my grandmother was when she passed now. So, I mean, she was a young woman when she passed.
Oh, yeah.
And she had accomplished so much. I mean, I look back on her life and I think, my God, what a motivated person.
Yeah.
She lived around the world. She had 3 sons when she was told she probably wouldn't even be able to conceive.
Mm-hmm.
She did, she moved to an altitude of 8,000 feet when she was had an expanding heart. I mean, she pushed the limits, but she lived to her own, the beat of her own drummer.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in many ways she was, she predated the beatniks and the hippies by being, true to herself, by following her own nature.
Just to shift a little bit towards the formation of the museum.
Well, here's what I can tell you, and that's, he loved museums. Even when we were children, we went to museums continuously.
Okay.
We were always going to museums, and he was a member in perpetuity at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. He was a member at all the museums in New York, and he loved museums. Mm-hmm. Now, when he started, I don't think he knew really a lot about museums. In fact, I don't think he knew anything about museums, but he wanted that collection to be displayed. He didn't want it to stay or be sold. Mm-hmm. And the lady who was sort of taking care of Millicent's Taos estate at the time, Dixie Yapel, was her secretary. Mm-hmm. She sort of took on the role of becoming the first museum director. Her husband was sort of an amateur archaeologist and had actually, even though he was Anglo, been raised in the Pueblo. So he was sort of instrumental in setting up some of the first exhibits. Some of them were not appropriate by today's standards, but I don't think anyone knew in those days.
Right.
And as time went on, I think my father realized that it had to become professional, that Dixie and John, in spite of their best nature, were not professional museum people.
Okay.
So he really began to look for someone who could do it. And the first, I think, was Jeff Mitchell, was the first, sort of professional museum director. He was followed by a number of others. And it wasn't really until Art Wolfe came on the scene in the 80s that the museum really headed toward being a professional organization.
Okay.
Art, I think, also influenced, what he thought the museum should be collecting. He saw some gaps in the collection. When he started, he did a lot of good things for the museum in terms of professionalizing it. And I think my father learned over the years a lot. Mm-hmm. As I said, he was not a museum professional. He had never expected to be. But the museum became, in many ways, all-encompassing at certain times in his life, especially when there were difficult transitions. It was, it was something that I think caused him a lot of delight, but a lot of anxiety at the same time,
Okay.
because he wanted it to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think any small museum in a small town has trouble,
Mm-hmm.
as ours did in many times. And even today, I worry that I would like to see this museum last far beyond my lifetime,
Oh,
and I'd
yeah.
like to see us get there before I pass.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got my mission.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah.
But the professionalism grew as time went on at the museum, and my father realized that that was necessary to make it a real important thing. And that's why he really also wanted it to be accredited. He wanted to
Yeah.
show that we had reached that level of professionalism.
And that was like in 80, I want to say 86. Was it 86?
It was in the 80s. I'm not sure
Yeah.
exactly
I
when.
think it was the
That
mid,
sounds about right.
yeah, I think it was the mid 80s. That's interesting because I hadn't really thought about, I mean, I knew the accreditation process had happened, but I hadn't thought about what that would have looked like before that happened. I mean, what does that look like before that happens? That's quite a process to go through. Um, and now that you say that, I'm curious about the other museums in Taos too, because we want to look at how we fit within the landscape of the Taos museums. I'm curious when the rest of them went through accreditation. I wonder what their process was as well, and how the museums sort of built that base of art and culture in Taos together. I think, and that I guess is not a question for you unless you know anything about those
I
time
don't.
frames.
I just
But it's an
don't.
interesting
I
lens.
know that. Yeah. I know that when we did get it, it was considered a real feather in our cap, and my
Oh
father
yeah,
was really, really delighted.
yeah, it's significant for sure.
No, for sure. And it's still, I still think it's, I would like to think that we'll never lose that accreditation and that we will keep our level of professionalism.
Right, right. I think that has to be the goal. Um, Well, good. I think we've covered everything. Is there anything else that you'd like to add or share about? Have you gone through that whole diary?
I did, but her script is difficult.
It is.
And I did get some information out of it, but it was a little bit like trying to read code. So,
Yep.
so I had some problems, but I enjoyed reading it. I definitely got an insight into her that I hadn't had previously, for sure.
I noticed when I was looking at it that it took a while, like I had to be in it for a while before my eyes and my brain got used to her handwriting, and then I could read more of it. And then when I took a photo of it and looked at it in more detail, it's even easier to read. But there was a portion I read it and I was like, oh, that's just so Millicent, because she was so young and she wrote something about going ice skating, and there was a girl there, and she writes about, of course, she had on her blue wool pants, and you know what that means. So I have to find somebody that actually like really knows what that means, because
I know.
no,
In
I don't.
1917, I'm not really sure what that would have meant.
But those kinds of things, and yeah, I want to get back in there and see more of it. But it was very impactful to see her drawings of the submarines and her talk about the war. And then that's when I'm thinking also, this is very interesting because this was right before women had the vote, and she's 14, 15. She's interested in the world, in politics. She's sketching things and commenting on it. And she writes a comment by one of the drawings of a submarine, sea monster, she labels it. And so, of course, immediately I think of her drawings, the mermaid drawings.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
clearly this was a form of communication and processing life writing and drawing, expressing yourself in that way. And then the drawing, of course, manifests in all the drawings that we have here at the museum. So, yeah, I think, I would like to have more conversations, like over time, and just because I think it's so relevant to make Millicent, allow her to be viewed in a broader, rounder perspective than somebody who, here's all her jewelry type of.
Yeah, this glamour puss that seems, sort of this untouchable figure. No,
Right.
she was very down to earth.
Yeah.
And, from everyone I've heard, she was, one of those people that was easy to talk to.
Mm-hmm.
She had a wicked sense of humor, and she loved practical jokes. And she was a great mimic. My father, I think he inherited her sense of humor because he had a great sense of the ridiculous. And apparently she must have as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I also think that her mother must have been a great influence on her because her mother was no shrinking violet. She was definitely a very strong woman. I mean, I don't know if she was a suffragette, but I can't see her not being, just from the
Right.
little I know about her strong will.
That would be,
So that may have been a strong influence as well.
yeah, that would be a really interesting narrative thread for me to explore, is Mary's, potentially what her role was during the suffragist time frame. And, something else along those lines is when Millicent came to Taos, Native American women still weren't allowed to vote. So,
Yeah.
all of those pieces, I think she was just, given all of her life experiences, she was very concerned about people and very compassionate. And that's something I really would like to show glimpses of more, like demonstrable glimpses. I think it's going to be important, not only now, but going forward with the museum. There was such upheaval, excuse me, culturally through the pandemic, and that first year when there were a lot of protests and people were looking at historical narratives and questioning everything, which is, that's good, that's all right. It needs to be dynamic, and but I think at the same time it offers us a good opportunity to expand the stories.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think she's a complex and multifaceted person. I think that her having to leave Austria and, her awareness of what was happening to the Jews in the beginning of the war made her very empathetic toward people that were oppressed.
Yeah, definitely. And then just one more quick thing, because I'm thinking of this as you're talking, the aspect of her going through 2 world wars and the impact of that. So I'm thinking about the sculpture, Death of an Airman, that we have in Gallery 15 right now. And I'm thinking about that in terms of this time period and the fact that World War One, there wasn't a lot going on as far as air. We only had, I think, 6 airplanes in our military at the beginning of World War One. So she actually, her life bridges the time period when air travel went from 0 to 100, and so that probably also, that has to have impacted her views on, life and progress and all kinds of things. And I'm wondering if that maybe played into some of her emotion about the Air Force and airmen, and being supportive of, like donating Claremont for people with PTSD, and just her take on that. Because
I think.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to say, I think that it did influence her. The Second World War and the terrible cost of the air battles that were fought in the Second World War, I think were much more influential to her. I mean, if you think of the early bombing rates in Germany where half of the pilots didn't, or half of the airplanes didn't come back,
Yeah.
I mean, they were taking huge casualties.
Yeah.
And her lover at the time was James and the Giant Peach.
Roald.
The
Roald.
author of
Yeah. Roald Dahl.
Roald Dahl. And when I look at that sculpture, I see Roald Dahl as the influence of that sculpture. If you look at the face, it almost looks like Roald Dahl.
Mm-hmm.
It was created around that time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was very much influenced by what was happening in the Second World War.
Yeah. And then would you be interested in at some point having other conversations like specific like this about maybe the things that I find in the journal or, you know?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it more. I don't really have anything to add because actually your questions kind of spur me to think. And if I'm just sort of thinking on my own, I'm not really sure where to go with it,
Sure.
But a good question can lead to a great discussion. So yeah, anytime.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, Philip. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. I'm glad to add a little bit of history that, hopefully gives a better idea of what Millicent was like.